It's my great pleasure to be here, and please accept this very modest introduction to these two gentlemen that we're about to enjoy. Adam Bell is a photographer, writer, and an educator. He received his MFA from here, SVA, in 2004. He is the co-editor of both Vision Anew, The Lens and Screen Arts, that was published in 2015, and The Education of a Photographer in 2006. And his writing and reviews have appeared in numerous publications, including After Image, The Art Book Review, Foam Magazine, Photo Eye, and the Brooklyn Rail. Adam is currently on staff and faculty at the MFA Photography, Video, and Related Media Department, once again here at the prestigious School of Visual Arts. David Campany is an eminent curator and writer on photography. His books include The Open Road, Photographic Road Trips Across America, and Walker Evans, The Magazine Work, both published in 2014, as well as Jeff Wall, Pictures for Women, 2010, and both Photography and Cinema in 2008 and Art and Photography in 2003. He also writes for Frieze, Aperture, Foam, PhotoWorks, the magazine of the Tate, and Aperture. David has received several awards for his writing, including the ICP Infinity Award, the Alice Award, and the Royal Photographic Society Award. This evening we'll discuss his new book, recently published by MACK Books, entitled A Handful of Dust, and he will also be signing copies of the book in the lobby after this evening. Without any further delay, please welcome both Adam and David up to the stage.
Thank you for coming out this evening.
Thank you.
I'm excited to be here.
Me too.
So I thought we would start this off maybe by going back a little bit in time.
Yeah.
So in 2005, you were asked to write an essay and pick a photo for the book Singular Images. And you chose Dust Breeding, the centerpiece of this show and book, as the image. And I was interested, in the catalog, you described that as the tip, and then this project is the iceberg. And I was wondering if you could talk about maybe why you chose this picture, and how did that essay lead to this book and show that is now
Well, it's interesting. I always think there are so many images in the world, and with most of them, one has a one-night stand, but occasionally there's an image with which you end up having a long-term relationship. But as with all long-term relationships, it's usually not the kind of entity that you choose for a one-night stand. And I saw this image in an exhibition when I was doing my first degree. It was one of those 150th anniversary of photography shows, so that's dating me somewhat. This was 1989. And there are a number of shows in Europe and North America that was kind of celebrating photography's birthday. And this was in 2 or 3 of them. And it just didn't fit in. It was a little print about this size, and it was just the oddest looking thing. And I knew the name Man Ray, and I knew the name Marcel Duchamp a little bit. But it didn't look like it had anything to do with surrealism or Dada. It didn't really look like other photography from that era. And I had a sort of adverse reaction to it. I just didn't like it, but in quite a strong way. And it just sort of worked in the back of my mind. And then I kept coming across it in other spaces. And it just became more and more gripping to me, this completely unlikely photograph. It ended up being called Élevage de poussière, which translates as dust breeding. And I can tell you something about how that photograph got made. Man Ray, here in New York, not very far from here, Man Ray was a painter and a sculptor, and he taught himself photography as a means of documenting his own paintings and sculptures, sort of for publicity or to show possible collectors. And he had no money, and Catherine Dreyer was about to set up a sort of forerunner of the Museum of Modern Art. It was called the Société Anonyme, and she asked Man Ray if he would photograph works in her collection. And he says in his rather hilarious and unreliable memoir, the thought of photographing the work of others was repugnant to me, beneath my dignity as an artist. And although he'd photographed his own artworks at this point already, it's just the idea of doing it, photographing the work of others, that's repugnant. And then in the next paragraph he says, so I went to see my friend Marcel Duchamp, had a studio at 1947 Broadway, not so far from here. And he said that he saw, lying on a sawhorses, a sheet of glass gathering dust. In fact, the entire studio was dusty. Duchamp had left the windows open while he'd gone to Europe and had come back. And he was collecting dust on this sheet of glass as a stage in what became his great work, The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors, even, also known as the large glass. And the idea was that you would gather dust sort of in different thicknesses, and the thicknesses of the dust would be a kind of visual measure of time, which is interesting. And Duchamp had said, well, why don't you practice your photography on this? And Man Ray set up his camera. He says in the memoir, I opened the shutter, we went out for something to eat, I came back, closed the shutter, developed the sheet that night, and the negative was perfect. And then he says, I was confident of all future assignments. Although the photograph doesn't look anything like your standard photograph of a sculpture or a painting, and maybe it couldn't because it's of such an unusual artwork. And I'd noticed that if you, just to go back to the photograph, if you pick up a Man Ray book, the photograph is sometimes there, not always, but it's sometimes there. And if it is there, it's regarded as a sort of visionary work, a kind of early, it's 1920, so it's sort of beginnings of photographic modernism. But it's definitely regarded as a work by Man Ray. But if you pick up a Marcel Duchamp book, it's like a production still in the making of this sculpture. It's like a document. So you've got this strange tension between artwork and document. And the eagle-eyed would have seen that this print, which was a print that was made in, it was one of 10 that was made in 1964, both decided to sign it rather provocatively.
Well, that gets to something that's sort of interesting, like between 2000 or 1922 and 45, it appears in a variety of different places.
Yeah.
And each time the caption changes and the authorship changes. Sometimes it's credited solely to Man Ray, other times it's credited to both of them.
Yeah.
Other times Man Ray is sort of pushed to the sideline. Can you talk about maybe some of the, like what those different captions meant and how it changed? And maybe you started to allude to this a bit, but how it starts to reveal what this image means as both a document and our artwork at the same time.
Yeah, so it's one of 4 photographs that Man Ray takes when he comes to Paris. And it first appears 2 years after he's taken it in this journal called Literature, which is a sort of bridge journal between Dada and Surrealism. And in there, this is how it appears. And you can see already that it's been cropped, and it's given this rather elaborate caption, "Behold the domain of Rose c'est la vie." Rose c'est la vie was a kind of female pseudonym that Marcel Duchamp had given himself. How arid it is, how fertile it is, how joyous it is, how sad it is. View from an aeroplane by Man Ray. View from an aeroplane. This is just a few years after the Second World War, and people would have been aware of aerial reconnaissance pictures. And there's also a sort of play on the ambiguity of this photograph. It doesn't have any intrinsic scale to it. You don't know quite what you're looking at. They decide to include what looks like a horizon, which is actually the edge of the glass and the Duchamp studio wall beyond. So when it first appears, they're already playing with it. It's something that's malleable. You can make this photograph do things if you want. And in fact, it wasn't exhibited for a long time, not until the 60s, and it had a life on the page. Interestingly, my book is titled A Handful of Dust, which you would probably know from T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. And that poem, the great poem of the sort of early modern era, happened to be published exactly the same month in London that this photograph was published in Paris, October 22. If you've got a little bit of an art historian in you, you can't really ignore coincidences like that. And I just thought, that's interesting. Also in October 1922, Ernest Hemingway flew over Paris and wrote for a newspaper, "Having seen Paris from the air, I now understand Cubism." This all happens at the same time. So you've got a nice little cluster of things going on there. And the photograph has all of these different lives in these different publications. This is Minotaur, a surrealist journal, and the photograph is in the background of this disc design that was meant to spin that Duchamp had put together. Duchamp published a box of notes to try and not really explain, but actually just make more intriguing the large glass, the big upright glass sculpture that he'd made. And it's a box of facsimile notes. But the box also includes a reproduction of the dust photograph. The photograph comes back to America and it appears in View, which was a surrealist-related journal edited by Charles Henry Ford, who writes a poem in homage to Duchamp and has it typeset over the top of the photograph, which is credited to Man Ray.
Yeah, so one of the things that's interesting at this point in the show and in the book is after talking about these early instances where the image appears in these different formats, and it doesn't really reappear until the late 50s, early 60s. Rather than jump ahead, you sort of digress and explore not only the suggested subject matter of the image, but also sort of associative meanings of the image. And you move from looking at aerial photography, landscape, even exploring connections to sort of early realist literature. And you sort of take us on a really interesting journey. Do you want to talk about why you did that and what you discovered as you were sort of exploring this period of the image?
Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing about photography, and I think the reason it was so important to the 20th century was that it just doesn't belong to any particular category. Art has a little bit of a hold on it, but so does every other field of the image. The sciences, the military, the police, forensics. And I think if you're genuinely interested in photography, you have to follow that madness. You can't just pursue it through art history, because you end up getting a very distorted idea of what makes photography fascinating or interesting or applicable or even ambiguous. And it seemed to me that there was something so intrinsically hybrid about that photograph. Here you have something that's regarded as an artwork, it's regarded as a document. They're already playing on scale, they're already playing on ambiguity of subject matter. They understand something about how a photograph changes its meaning depending on its context and its caption. And you could say that's a beautiful license to explore all of those connections, or you could say you don't need a license to do that at all. It just comes with photography, that it just sort of spirals out like that. The interesting thing about dust is that it attracted the very earliest commentators on photography. The people who saw some of the very first photographs would often notice that, a daguerreotype will pick up dust in the corner or on the cornices of a shelf, or in the ruins of a building, or it would just be gathering on a table that hadn't been cleaned properly. Everyone knows this. If you've taken a photograph and looked closely at it, you always get more than you bargain for. Nobody really wants dust. And in fact, in many ways, dust becomes the enemy of modernity and modernism. The modern world is the clean, hygienic world. Polished surfaces, steel, glass, concrete. So dust becomes this thing that photography will pick up. It's also the enemy of photography, It's the stuff you have to keep away from your camera, even though it's very photogenic. So
it's interesting, it becomes a sort of both a metaphor and a signifier for a whole host of other things that allow you to sort of explore, and which goes back to that coincidence that you talked about of the connection with the T.S. Eliot. Dust can reveal a lot in many ways.
Yeah, and there, in so many of the writers of the 20th century who tried to come to grips with, what the medium is, it's interesting how often dust comes up. Roland Barthes refers to it. André Bazin referred to it. Walter Benjamin speaks about dust. Siegfried Kracauer. They all understand that that dust is there as a kind of literal subject matter, because dust is an inevitable consequence in the world. But also it is this measure of time. It is a sort of entropy, or there's something cosmic about it. There's something inevitable about it. So dust is always a kind of material thing and a symbol at the same time. And also, as the realist novel gets going, sort of in the 19th century, you think of Charles Dickens. Dickens is always describing dust or damage or the wear and tear on people's faces or clothes. All of that extraneous stuff becomes the guarantee of the real. You can flip it around and think about it another way. When in Photoshop, the more you sort of clean up an image and get rid of its imperfections, the less photographic it looks, to the point where you end up with something that's so kind of Spartan and hygienic, it ceases to feel like a photograph. Mm-hmm. So the book does draw out all of these strange implications of this photograph. The aerial view in particular, which has a very interesting relation to sort of modern art, because on the one hand, the aerial view becomes so important as a form of reconnaissance and surveillance. But someone like Steichen here, for example, who heads up a military photography unit during the war, starts to recycle his photographs as kind of modern artworks, literally taking the pictures he's made during the war out of context, presenting them as a kind of new kind of landscape picture.
And since this project did seem to take a sort of long time, like it seemed to really, it was sort of on the back burner maybe, and were you gathering this material and sort of putting together this as a potential exhibition or book during this sort of 10-year period, or did it finally arise as an opportunity? And
yeah, you sort of, I don't know, I sort of mentally stockpile things. But I had been edging towards a way of thinking that might be based on editing. The interesting thing about editing is it's a word that writers use, curators use, and photographers use, and that needs a lot of unpacking. But briefly to say that quite often the meanings we make are in the connections between things. And I've been moving towards a way of writing that might be based on a kind of image track, where you might select and sequence the pictures first before you write. And now I'm at the point where if I write something, even if I'm commissioned by a magazine, I don't agree to do it unless, well, first of all, I work out what the image track might be, and then ask the editors if I can have those images. And then it's a sort of fear of the blank page. As a writer, I don't really like just trying to get words on the page. I'd rather put an image on the page and kind of say, well, okay, well, how would I get from that image to that image?
And it seems sort of similar in a way, like you did that in your book, Photography and Cinema, where it was sort of constructed around these images to make a sort of visual argument that accompanied the text. And we were talking earlier, like one thing that struck me is that this project almost seems like a sort of midway point between your other project, Gasoline, which was all from sort of found images that you put together to create a kind of visual essay, and the more sort of rigorous academic pieces like art and photography, and trying to find this new form, which I think is really interesting, that's sort of looser.
Well, I think they're all rigorous, but I
oh, no, I'm not. They are.
I know.
Yeah.
There is a certain kind of writing that we're led to believe is the rigorous kind of writing. I understand that, and I can do that, and I pick up that idiom now and again.
Well, looking through the book, there's a sense that it's much looser, and then you read the essay and you say, wow, there's this incredible depth to it, and you start to make all these connections, and you go back through the images and start to see this is really incredible, and there is an incredible depth to it, but it feels like there's a sense of, it feels freer maybe in a way. I don't know what the...
If the French philosopher Maurice Blanchot talked about the condition of being an exile in the world of images. If you're a sort of image person, you often feel that you are sort of beguiled or seduced or held by images. And it's very easy to see that as a weakness. It's not analytical, or it's not rational. But I do have a high regard for that kind of grip that images have on us, and their resonances are often very, very unpredictable. And I think quite often the kind of consciously theoretical modes that we have for writing about images often don't get us anywhere near that madness. And I think very, very few writers have got near to it. And maybe you don't need to write at all. Maybe you just have those experiences when you look at pictures, or you intuit something about the relation between one picture and another as you're moving through a book, or if you're moving through an exhibition. That's why I said editing is an interesting kind of bridge between, editing is an interesting condition of the image and of writing. I love this. This is from Vue, French magazine.
Yeah, can we go through some of the pictures that...
Look at these. I have no idea how these were made. These are by a French photographer called Boiffard, whose images appeared in, not these images, but made images for the sort of dissident surrealist journal called Document. And what's he? I don't know. Really, I had no idea. There's a sort of a face that you can see in the one on the far right. I don't know. Is he shooting through a kind of dirty window? Maybe. I don't know. There's a kind of dust is the most impoverished material you could imagine. But there's always been a kind of feeling that if artists are the creatures of the margins, unless they become rich, and then they're the creatures of the establishment, and nobody really likes them at that point. But if they're the creatures of the margins, it seems natural that they will pick up marginalia as subject matter. Marginalia could be people, marginalia could be materials, marginalia could be places. Vols's photographer was a completely impoverished photographer, barely had enough food on his table to eat, but would make these absolutely beautiful pictures out of, just whatever he had around. Kind of just making work out of necessity to try and sort of stay sane in very difficult times. Frederick Summer out in the deserts of Arizona, making these really peculiar landscape pictures. And then even someone like Jeff Wall continuing that line. Then I pick up other threads. The dust storms in America. It's very interesting when the Man Ray photograph comes back to America in the 40s, an overhead view of a kind of dusty plain. I can't help but think that most people would have read it in relation to, the experience of the dust storms of the 30s. I'm very fond of old press photographs that have been discarded. Lots of American newspapers are throwing away and selling off their archives at the moment. And when they're gone, they're gone. So these were bought on eBay for $5 a piece.
And you sort of move back and forth in time a bit, like at least in the book, where you might jump forward to a contemporary image and then move back in time. And what was your thinking in terms of structuring it that way and not being
the unconscious has no sense of time. We're always going backwards and forwards. And this is the weird thing about history or even art history, that when you come to something, like an image by an artist, and you're interested in them, you're then sort of finding out what went before, and then if they're still alive, you're following them, and then there's this strange way that all artists are contemporary artists and figures from the past at the same time. I remember talking to Stephen Shaw about this, and he said, "Yeah, it's a real burden. You've made good work, and you're trying to make good work, and but I think that's a sort of broader problem. But there's also an interesting way in which quite often, if something strikes you as being a precedent for something else, it sort of implies a sort of lineage, but the thing didn't become a precedent until you discovered what it was a precedent for. So time and the experience of images is always sort of folded back on itself. And again, I don't think the ways we have of writing about images and their effects on us get us very close to that. Look at these postcards of dust storms. Amazing.
And are these all images that you found?
Yeah. There's a show in Paris, which I've curated at a wonderful space called Le Bal, and it has things in it, by Walker Evans or Man Ray and Marcel Duchamp and Jeff Wall and Gerhard Richter and Jeff Mermelstein, who's here. Great figures. And at the same time, there are 73 things in the show that I bought on eBay. And in fact, a very, very serious French journalist on the opening night said to me, "Oh, yeah, you must have been doing some very deep archival research." And I said, "Yeah, and eBay." But again, that's what I said at the beginning. If you want to follow the image, you should be prepared to follow it where it goes. Yeah. Look at this, so amazing, this picture. A very beautiful library in the centre of London was bombed very early in the war, and the roof fell in, but the book stacks remained. And there's moving footage of this as well, kind of news footage of these men carrying on. I sort of feel like one of the. I feel like a man carrying on, picking over the rubble of the 20th century. I think that's what I was doing in this book. It's me coming to terms with the great ruin that was the 20th century. Look at this. This is Mussolini's car. This is the car from which Mussolini was dragged and lynched. And his Lancia ended up in a garage. And this is a press photograph from 1955, made on the occasion of the garage deciding that it wanted to get rid of the car and it would sell it to whoever paid the parking fine. Presumably this mechanic has been asked by the press photographer to kind of signify how long the car has been there by kind of wiping his hand through the dust on the bonnet.
Was this a photo you found?
Yeah.
Yeah, well.
Yeah. And there are all kinds of strange, sort of unpredictable resonances with other kind of photographs of ruin that you find. And I think this implication is already there in the very first appearance of the Man Ray picture, view from an aeroplane just after the First World War. And so often the images of devastation of the Second World War end up looking like the Man Ray picture that was taken just after the First World War. And then...
Yeah, so we jump forward,
Yeah.
right? And the image appears, I guess, in 59, right? It appears in a Man Ray show, and then sort of maybe two other times, but then it really appears again in 1970 as part of the information show at MoMA. And then Rosalind Krauss writes an important article about it, or mentions it in an important article, and there's also an essay written about Duchamp's artwork where it gets brought up as well, or his relationship to Bruce Nauman. And what took so long for it to come back, and maybe why it came back?
Marcel Duchamp's career, Man Ray's to an extent, but Marcel Duchamp's career is so weird. Everyone thought Duchamp had retired from making work, and at the end of the 20s or something, but he kind of continues to be active. The generation that ended up, I suppose, being called sort of pop and conceptual generation picked up on Duchamp sort of end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s, Rauschenberg, John Cage, and then people like Bruce Nauman. And then, Duchamp gets heralded as the sort of godfather of many things: conceptual art, performance art, mixed media art generally, because he'd made films, he'd made publications, he wasn't committed to any one medium, so he becomes a kind of key figure for a generation that discovers him while he's still alive. I mean, so many people thought he was dead.
But it's also about
again, he becomes a figure from the past and a contemporary artist at the same time. And yeah, this is amazing. This is a page from the MoMA catalogue, Information. Information is really the first time a major museum had done a survey show of conceptual art. And they were attempting to map out what would be the artistic concerns of the coming decade. And there's a little section of images, a kind of curated image section, 16, 20 pages. And here it is. So this is an image that's 50 years old at this point, is heralding the art to come.
And it gets at this idea of the photograph as a document and the importance of a document at that time, right? Or what a photograph could mean in its relationship to a work of art, whether or not it's a performance or a sculpture.
Yeah, and you know, information, it's a word you associate with documents, and suddenly information is now an art word, or there's a sort of embrace of the fact that an artist might use or make documents or information, or they'd be thinking about communicating in a different kind of way. I mean, the cover of the catalogue has all of the, you know, it's got a reel-to-reel there, and an Instamatic camera, and a TV, and a telephone, and a typewriter. And yet there's this kind of weird arcane image, 50-year-old image of dust as the great heralder of the new.
And you talk about how it kind of, rather than going through the sort of gates of fine art, it sort of sneaks in the back door, and it gets sort of acceptance through this back alleyway or unpredictable way, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, it is, because it's the age-old problem, well, the 50, 60-year-old problem, I guess, of there being sort of specialist art photographers, and then the artists associated with pop and conceptualism that didn't identify with the medium, but used the medium in all kinds of different ways. And there was that tension, which was very real, I suppose, between photographers and artists using photography. I wouldn't sweep that under the table. I think those tensions, frustrating as they were, did signal something, and they signaled a kind of paradox built into the medium, I think, which we still can't ignore. I mean, photography's relation to art is still conditional upon its status as a tricky status as a document. But there's no getting away from that. It's what animates it in many ways. So yeah, it's there. There's the page from an article from Art Forum, 1972, where Robert Pincus Witten talks very explicitly about Duchamp's work as a kind of forerunner for Bruce Naumann's work and the work of other artists of his generation, and this explicitly invokes the dust-breeding image. Yeah, probably the most sort of widely read piece of sort of art theory or criticism of the 70s. Rosalind Krauss's Notes on the Index makes a big play of this photograph and of how strange the index is, or the indexical quality of photography as a trace. And she picks on this image. So it's a curious thing. I mean, I'm sort of mapping it out, but it's a bit like you get a little obsession in your head. Let's say, you know, my daughter is very interested in red shoes at the moment. She saw a pair of red shoes in a shop, sort of wanted the red shoes, and she sees red shoes everywhere. It's a little bit like that. Once you get a preoccupation, you
see dust everywhere.
You see dust. You see its implications everywhere, and you have to be attendant to that irrationality and that madness. You know, good things can come out of it, and then you have to sort of double check and be sure, you know, you're not just being mad. So part of what I've been doing in this book and also the show that's in Paris is a biography of that image. I mean, images are things that do have biographies, particularly photographs, you know, where they appear, how they appear, at what point they disappear and then reappear. These things are interesting. If you can follow those biographies, they can tell you a lot.
Because you've talked about how the show and the book is really a sort of mapping of influence and associations rather than a sort of strict chronological history.
It's a map of resonance, I suppose, rather than influence. There's only one work in the exhibition and in the book which is a direct influence. I could have pulled on others, but I don't think influence is as interesting as resonance. I'll get to that in a minute, maybe. Sort of art of the ruin and dust. Robert Filliou here. Imagine doing this now. I'll tell you what Filliou did. He went to the Louvre and he took several cloths with him, and he would voluntarily clean paintings. Just go up to the paintings and clean a Titian or a Velázquez. clean the dust off it. And then he would have a Polaroid taken of himself doing it. And then he would put the cloth and the Polaroid in a box as a sort of fluxus artwork. And he wrote at the time, rather provocatively, the aura of these paintings is in the dust, and I've taken the aura away. And if I were to wipe this cloth over another painting, I would transfer the aura.
How often did he get away with that?
One to another. He made about 100 of these.
Wow.
This is Ed Ruscha and his pals throwing the typewriter out of the window and documenting rather forensically the ruins that they've made. Did anyone see Did you see the Mason Williams show that was here in New York? Did anyone see that? Fantastic show. Mason Williams collaborated with Ruscha on the making of that book. And there's a strand of resonance throughout the whole project which looks at the relation between sort of destruction and creativity. If the 20th century is the century that was constantly destroying and remaking itself through war, through built-in obsolescence, then it's no surprise that a very deep connection starts to be made between ruining things and creating things. And some of my very favourite photographs of the series that John DeVola did in the 1970s, where he would sort of break into disused buildings and vandalise them, but slightly too artily. So he'd use the tools of the vandal, the sharp knife or the aerosol spray can, but would just be a bit too effete about it and kind of measured about it, knowing that he was also going to photograph it, and the photograph itself would introduce all of these other ambiguities, the same way that Man Ray's photograph of the dust does. So this looks like some weird optical interference. You can't quite see whether the dots are on that space or somehow in front of it. And it's very interesting how often this kind of photograph, the kind of pseudo-forensic picture of traces, sort of recurs in the art of the 70s. It's always regarded as the sort of era that had no style or had no dominant sort of ism. And then the 80s arrived and there's a whole look to it. But I'm not sure that's entirely true. There's so much interest in traces and after effects in the 70s. Or maybe it's just me and I just keep noticing
I mean, when you
these kind of patterns.
with this book, I had never thought of it as sort of parodying or making fun of the kind of
Yeah.
artwork that was being made at the time, which you sort of point out at the time. By the time they make this, there's so much art being made that looks like a sort of document or has this forensic approach,
Yes.
that by the time they make this book, you know, it's
Yeah.
almost sort of making fun of it a bit.
Yeah, just to explain this, just in case you don't know, you might have just walked in off the street. I hope you have. That's a good thing. Two artists, Larry Sultan and Mike Mandel, visited all kinds of archives, not art image archives, police archives, scientific archives, laboratory archives, fire department archives. And they saw in excess of 1 million pictures and then put a book together of 60 or so of these things, but made it just like an art book with just a picture and no writing. And so a photograph that was once made as a very functional document suddenly becomes very, very ambiguous. And this is the opening picture of the book that they give the deliberately provocative title, Evidence. Footprints in something and a pencil for scale. And a little bit of a herbaceous border. Louis Baltz photographing Nevada. A kind of man-altered desert. And Jeff Wall's Destroyed Room, perhaps his first major work, where he plays arty vandal, not unlike John Devola, setting up a studio space and ruining it, but making a photograph that might be an artwork insofar as it's a photograph of something that's been artistically arranged, but the arrangement is also a form of ruin, and you get the connections.
So yeah, so you towards the end of the exhibition, you include a lot of contemporary work.
Yeah.
Work by Simon Norfolk, Louise Oates, Javier Ribas, and a number of others. And I was wondering, what drew you to those artists? And maybe we can look at a few examples of their work, and you can talk about why you chose to include them.
Well, I was always struck by a certain kind of politics that must have been there in the calling of that picture, a view from an aeroplane, and kind of invoking the First World War and everything that implied about a kind of organized, sort of mechanized destruction. And it seemed to me that photography, by the end of the 20th century, had found itself in a very interesting place where it was a sort of secondary medium. And it certainly feels like a secondary medium now. I don't mean an obsolete medium. By secondary, I mean, I don't think anyone in their right mind would say 2015, it's the year of photography. The energy's gone somewhere else. And once a medium has been sort of eclipsed or sidelined, it's sort of free to do other things. And one of the things it does is to sort of revisit things. So you have a lot of documentary photographers and photojournalists who don't want to be there when an event happens. They want to kind of come along afterwards and sort of survey what's happened. So there's a kind of afterwardsness about photography, which I find really interesting, and it means that photographers have a different relation to history and the making of history and of time. We'll come to some more explicit works in a minute, but I'm very fond of this piece, which is by Ava Stenram, and she bought from NASA high-res files of the first images made that came back from Mars. And she turned them into color negatives. And then she put the negatives under her bed and just let dust gather on them, as Duchamp had done, and then made prints. So you get these images from Mars, and nobody's ever been to Mars. Not even Matt Damon has been to Mars, and yet this is kind of floating particles from under the artist's bed on top of these things. It doesn't really do justice. They're very, very. The screen is good, but it's not good enough. They're very, very gorgeous prints. But then the real kind of key work for me, and it's a work that now has quite an interesting status, because I think people realize how far ahead she was. Sophie Risselhuber, French artist, saw an aerial photograph in Time magazine of the bombing of the Iraqi army that had invaded Kuwait. This is 1991. And I don't know if you remember, but the Allied forces bombed the Iraqi army out of Kuwait, and in doing so they left behind everything, as all retreating armies do, and they set fire to the oil fields. And Risselhuber saw this tiny little photograph, it's about this big, in Time magazine, an aerial photograph, and was inspired to go. This was at the end of the war. And she went and she walked on foot, and she also took flights over the Kuwaiti desert and made these pictures of this sort of evacuated space. So the events have happened and they've gone, and now here's a photographer arriving afterwards to look. And she made these very, very large photographs and a very, very small book called Fait, 1992. F-A-I-T, Fait, means fact or done in French. It was just after I'd finished my degree. I worked in a bookshop at the Institute of Contemporary Arts, and I thought this was the most extraordinary and profound book I'd seen in a long time, and I tried to sell it to anyone who came in the shop, and nobody bought it. They should have done. If you want to buy one now, it costs you about $2,000.
Because her photograph is probably the only one, I think, in the show that was directly influenced by...
Here's the Time magazine image. That's the article that she'd read. So she's triggered to go to Kuwait by seeing this picture. But the image she has in mind, and this is where we come to the very strange way that photographs can resonate with us. The image she has in mind is the Man Ray photograph of dust, or the Man Ray Duchamp photograph. And she wrote, this was in a statement that she made shortly after she first exhibited the work. By shifting from the air to the ground, I sought to destroy any notion of scale, as in Man Ray and Marcel Duchamp's Élevage de Poussière. It's a picture which fascinates me and which I kept in mind throughout my time I was working out there. The constant shift between the infinitely big and the infinitely small may disorientate the spectator. But it's a good illustration of our relation to the world. We have at our disposal modern techniques for seeing everything, apprehending everything, yet we see nothing. Isn't that weird that an artist goes to the deserts of Kuwait after a kind of catastrophic war that is not resolved, still isn't resolved, and she has in mind an image made on Broadway of dust on a sheet of glass that was 72 years old at that point. It's mind-boggling, it's such an odd thing, but it just shows you that you cannot predict what kind of images are going to affect you and how. So this one is in fact, when she exhibited the work and published the work, she left this photograph out. And only a few years ago, 6-7 years ago, she finally made an exhibitable print, and it was she took it out because she felt embarrassed about how similar it looked to the Man Ray Duchamp picture.
What do you think changed her mind? Did you ask her? Or was it long enough that it...
I was always
She
prompting
accepted.
her about it, but I don't know. I don't know. But it's interesting that it's a deliberate recognition of the influence, because it's called, because of the dust breeding, à cause de l'élevage de poussière, a kind of sort of final acceptance that was partly the source of it. Simon Norfolk in Afghanistan. And then some of the most contemporary work that's in the book and the show is this very interesting project by Nick Waplington, where what you're seeing are young Palestinians picking over the rag pickers. The way Baudelaire said that the rag pickers are the ones that are the foretellers of history. If you want to understand an era, you look at its trash. You don't look at its celebrities or its kings or queens. It's in the trash. It's in the gutter. That's where you'll find the truest measure of a society. And this is a trash dump that the Israelis have on land that they grabbed. So they grabbed it just to dump their trash, and it's picked over by these Palestinian children. And Nick Waplington made photographs on an 8x10 camera, but also made abstract paintings. And they're both responses to the same thing. There's no reason why that painting can't be as much of a document as the photograph. And on the opening night, this French art critic sort of took issue with me over this point, that I was just stretching it a bit too far. But his son was in the gallery too, and was sort of pointing at these relations between... He got it, he understood perfectly. Why not? Why can't that be a document? But it's just to do with certain kind of categories that we're supposed to put things in order to understand the world. But who cares about that,
And that's part of what makes the image so interesting.
Of course.
Because it doesn't fit in any of these categories,
No.
and it's all these different things at once.
Yeah.
Which makes it kind of...
Yeah.
It makes it possible for all these explorations that you've done in the exhibition.
And how often do you see a photograph next to an abstract painting? And how often do you see a photograph and an abstract painting that are both responses to the same thing? I mean, interestingly, Duchamp was always kind of wavering between whether he would describe the large glass as being a painting or a sculpture. I quite like. Oh, and this is Robert Burley, who made a long-term project, sort of about the end of the analog era. And he's photographing the destruction of one of the Kodak plants at Rochester. And of course, he's shooting on 4x5 Kodak film. So that's analog photography witnessing its own destruction there. And the people watching it are former employees. It's actually part of a sequence, and that cloud just rolls over you, like those 30s dust storms.
In this quote, we were talking about this earlier,
Yeah.
and I remember reading at the beginning of the essay and going back to it and thinking that it was almost too perfect. Like, it seems to encapsulate all the themes within the exhibition in your essay, and it touches on something essential about photography, and it's just...
Yeah. It is something he said. Sable said it in a radio broadcast. I read it in a transcript of a radio broadcast. But everywhere... And I use it at the beginning of the book. But people are always saying to me, did you make it up? And I didn't make it up. But the reason they say it is because it got out that when I did a book called Photography in Cinema, my editor said, can we have a really pithy quote at the beginning? And it has this has this line which just says, "Everything starts in the middle," by Graham Lee. And my editor said, "Brilliant, brilliant, this is fantastic." And then on the night that the book was launched, I said, "I have to confess that I made this up." And Graham Lee are actually my middle names. But now, Sable did say that.
We believe you.
Did say that. I wouldn't attribute it to that would be, illegal, wouldn't it, to claim that a real person said something that they didn't. But I should say something.
Yeah, let's talk about the book, because
Yeah.
the book is a kind of really unusual
Yeah, it
exhibition
is.
catalog in that it's actually sort of almost 3 books, where the essay is sandwiched in the middle,
Yeah.
and they're captions, but there's mostly no text as you move through the image, so
Yeah.
you're forced to make these connections between and really come to terms with
Yeah.
the argument that you're making visually in the book.
Yeah.
And then you read the essay and it all sort of clicks and you start to say, wow, this is really rich and interesting.
Well, it's nice to hear that. That's the idea. But yeah, it was. So here I am, sort of verbalizing for an hour with you about
Maybe we should open it
how
up.
images have these non-verbal qualities and non-verbal relations, and how on earth are you going to convey that in a book? And I was on my bike on the way down to the studio of Michael Mack, who I think is a genius as a publisher, thinking, shit, how are we going to do this? I've got this text and it's nearly 30,000 words, and I don't want this text-heavy book. I want these images to have these strange relations to each other. What are we going to do? Are we just going to have a text track along the bottom, or is all the writing at the back? Or so we're sitting in there, and it's supposed to be the kind of first design meeting, and you should expect with a really good publisher to be, thrashing things out and testing lots and lots of ideas out. But he'd just opened this sort of jiffy bag with some samples from a binder. And this binder had worked out a way of having a kind of booklet, perfect bound booklet, sort of within the body of another book. I just looked at it and I said, that's it. We have to do that. So it has this entire section that comes out, and this is for the theory and history heads. Or you can look at it just as a completely uncaptioned image track. And that was exactly how I wanted the book to work. And it's very rare. There are a lot of novelties in book production these days. Everyone's after a kind of gimmick. I hope people don't see it as gimmicky, because I think it perfectly suits what I was trying to do. Something that could be talked about in very theoretical and philosophical terms, but also to kind of let you loose amid these weird resonances between things. So I was kind of super happy with the format of the thing. That's the Sophie Grissom-Huber's book version of Faith, the Kuwait project. This piece slides out.
Was there any thinking in terms of like the placement of that book in there, or was it just had to go in the center in order to make it? Because initially it reminded me of this sort of gap where the image disappears and sort of goes into a bit of dormancy, and then it comes back, which doesn't necessarily totally coincide there, but it fits with the sort of life of the image itself in an interesting way. And so you get to this midpoint, and then there's this whole history that you can draw out, and then you're sucked back into the images, and you're led along the argument further.
Yeah, but then there's this. I mean, we made a kind of dummy of it first, and I was very worried about if you had a big section like that came out of the book, what would it be like? And I love the fact that the book flicks just the same, as if that could just be, left on the subway. And in fact, I realise why I said left on the subway now, because I got sent an advanced copy. And so it was the first copy in the country. And I thought, great, I'll show my students. They'll know what I've been sweating over. And I left it on the subway. Had to phone Michael Mack. I said, that one that was FedExed over, the very first copy that came straight to my door? Well, I had it about 20 minutes, and then I left it on the train. And he said, well, it's a book about dust, that's fine. Just
I hope whoever discovered it enjoyed it.
float away.
And so it's also
Yeah.
an exhibition.
Yeah, it's an
and
exhibition.
La Balle is kind of a really cool and unusual place. And this is, I think, the second show that you've done with them. Is that right?
Third.
The third?
Yeah.
What's the other one? Because there's the Anonymous, and then...
Lewis Baltz.
Oh, right.
Co-curated a Lewis Baltz show. Yeah.
So can you talk about maybe working with them? And
Well, La Balle is extraordinary. This is their 5th anniversary show, and I co-curated their opening show. This is a space that's dedicated to the document in the expanded sense. And it's set up by a woman called Diane Dufour, who's just a force, an amazing sort of energy. And I'd sort of paid my dues with them, and she said, "What's your dream project?" Of course, you shouldn't really do your dream project. It's a bit like talking about your dreams in public. It's rubbish. Share that with your analyst. But I said, I don't think I would ever do that. But she said, come on, what would it be? And I said, well, it would be a show about dust. And she got intrigued, and she's probably the only person who would, I think, get intrigued and take the risk. And I sort of said, look, it'll feel like a slightly mad show, because the pitch I made, which is the proposition in the show, is I don't have a photograph install shot, but on this wall that you can't see is just the Man Ray Duchamp picture, with a kind of text saying what this picture is, and maybe this picture is the key to the 20th century. Actually, maybe if you follow what's implied by that image, uncontained by art history, if you just follow all of those implications, the aerial view, the ruin, the weird mix of photographs from different parts of visual culture, if you follow all of that, you'll get a really interesting picture of the 20th century. It's not the one you would probably expect. But it's a little bit like the Invisible Man. You can't see the Invisible Man, but if you throw enough bits of paper in that direction, you'll get the outline. And so that's what we do. And so in that case, there is a little bit like that, the biography of the image that I've talked about from its first appearance, coming up towards the present. You can see the dust storm photographs on the wall at the back.
And how long did that take? When did you propose the show? And
maybe 2 years ago.
okay.
And I'd been fumbling around with that text for a long time, just for me. And then I had to try and sort of turn it into a book. But I had real anxieties about it being a book, because for the reasons I said, that you don't want. There's a paradox in trying to write a theoretical text about how there's something just so irrational about images. The way they behave and the way they have these influences. I didn't want it to sound like a horrible, sometimes you read like a horrible bad piece of literary criticism about a really good piece of literature, I didn't want it to be like that. So I half thought we'd have the writing would be done just for me to get the book to the point it was, and then I would sort of take the writing out, and it would just be a sort of purely visual book. And I half had that in mind, and then it was only when we sort of landed on that as a format that I thought, okay, well, we'll keep it that way. And then there's another image of the downstairs. But lots of works in the show I haven't really talked about. There's a Mona Kuhn piece, a Xavier Ribas, a Gerhard Richter, film here by Kirk Palmer. It's an amazing space. I mean, I've been trying to get other venues interested in taking the show, but as soon as you say it's a show about dust, they just kind of go. Because I know it's a very beautiful show, and it's already.
Well, hopefully when people see it,
So people will
in
see
Parry
it
Photo,
during
they'll
Parry Photo, and then hopefully
they'll get it.
someone else. Yeah, literally they'll get it, and they'll want to take the show, but we'll see, because it went hysterically over budget. So we need partners for the show. Can't believe it was so expensive, considering 73 of the items came out of my bag.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do we, now seems like maybe a good time, do you want to open it up
Yeah.
to some questions?
Yes.
You said during the sort of back end of the talk there that you were thinking of the book as you kind of picking over the ruin of the 20th century.
Yeah.
And I just wondered, you know, thinking about this contemporary work, it's good that we landed on this in-store shot, because I wonder how you think of dust at the back end of the 20th century as opposed to the beginning. And that Xavier Ribas body of work, Nomads, seems to be so much about migration and placelessness. And I wonder whether there are different kind of thematic interpretations of how dust should be read in terms of the work that's at the back versus the front of the book.
Yeah. It's interesting that, yeah, there's one understanding of sort of modernity and modernism, that it's, you know, a kind of restart, a fresh start, a clean start. The new world would be a world of hygiene, of polished steel. I don't want to sound like some kind of fascist futurist, but that's a part of it. And then it turned out to be, you know, a century of appalling destruction, atomic dust clouds, and meanwhile, you know, the bleeding hearts and the artists, to use a horrible Pink Floyd lyric, they were always interested in dust. And so they understand dust as the sort of repressed of the 20th century. And it just seems if we're going to learn any kind of lessons, it's going to be, you know, how do you live with your own dust? How do you live with your own dust, but also symbolically, what's your relation to destruction going to be, and what's your relation to the dust of others going to be? You know, most domestic dust is skin. Yeah, one could spin this on forever, but I think it's an interesting problem. But it sounds like you've got something in mind, Stanley. What was your?
No, I was wondering about one of the things that it seems that you're doing with the installation is looking at sprawl.
Yeah.
You've talked about resonance, and there's one of those wonderfully kind of contradictory ways of thinking about dust that also seems to make me think about photography having to do with it seeming to be free.
Yeah.
And utterly kind of untethered, and then simultaneously subject to every kind of other more powerful force.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the way that I mean, it's not so much visible in this, but I've obviously seen other install shots that you'd shown me from the show. I sort of wonder about motion and about objects that are in fact fundamentally susceptible to other much more substantial forces. And it seems that this sort of way of thinking through a history of a century and a history of images functions seems, also to open other kind of interpretive possibilities.
Yeah.
And I know you've been talking about looking through different kind of uses of photography outside of just an art historical context.
Yeah.
So I just wonder how you think, how you're thinking about the specifically contemporary quality of dust, if you like. I know it sounds like
No, I think it's a good point. But I think the more contemporary works I selected for the show do come from this sort of understanding of photography itself now being a kind of dust. Photography itself now being this kind of secondary thing is displaced. What on earth is the still mute image doing in the era of the moving image and the sound and all the rest of it? Photography itself feels like a cast-off. And cast-offs are always interesting. What you do with a cast-off is I mean, I'm always intrigued by, why an 18 or 19-year-old really takes to photography now. As an image that doesn't really embody the times in which we live. I know there are more images taken now than ever before, and more will be taken in the next 3 minutes than were ever taken in the 19th century altogether. I understand the numbers, but at the same time, there's a sort of feeling that something just kind of arcane about photography now, and it doesn't matter whether it's analog or digital. It's just this kind of still muteness that seems slightly removed. And so it's no surprise that it turns its attention to cast-offs as a sort of subject matter. It just seems inevitable somehow. It's a proposition, though. I mean, I'm not. It's not an absolute thing. It's just trying to. I just feel I'm sort of just groping in the dark about these kinds of questions. I don't have a watertight case. It's just a lot of sort of hunches and things.
Thanks.
Sure.
Great. Thank you. Any other questions?
I'm a 20-year-old who's taken an interest in photography.
Yay. What's attracting you to photography?
Well, I was thinking about how I think that myself and other 20-year-olds, 18, 19, 20-year-olds who are interested in photography have grow up with an appreciation for the dust in the picture. As like almost a nostalgia. And wanting to relate to that so badly because there's a kind of meaning in pictures that are imperfect because we grew up with being able to make perfect images very easily, and then I kind of started thinking about like how that relates to like an Instagram filter that will make your picture look really old. But then that being used by corporations that would once have made the perfect polished picture, but also like Instagram is that way of like engaging in that retromania of like Instagram being the Woodstock of my generation. So I guess I was just sort of wondering what, I mean, this is something that you're getting into, but I think it's something that we kind of grew up with.
Is it an acquired nostalgia for you?
I don't think
Because
so.
having confessed that you're 20, thereabouts, so your relation to the imperfection of the image, was that something you experienced once and then you had it taken away from you?
Oh, I think definitely. I think like
You experienced, or you're aware that
I think
past decades had experienced?
No, I don't know about past decades, but I think
Right.
I experienced, and I think in like photo 101 classes, like what draws like an 18-year-old today to want to take an analog picture, and they come to their professor and they say, but I like the dust and I like
Yeah,
the-"
yeah,
and
yeah.
the
So
professor's
it's
like, no, don't do that.
yeah, exactly. So it's attractive because it's not the state of the art image. It's the secondary medium of the sweepings up and there's something redemptive in that for you. Yeah, I'd go along with that.
So you could stop by some high schools and pick up some of the photos in trash bins and put them.
Yeah. Yeah. Somebody on the opening night said, what is your philosophy of curating? And I was tired, but I said, choose great work and don't fuck it up.
That's great. That seems like a good place to end it. Thank you very much, David. It's great.